Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Imagine a man who ruthlessly profits off selling, intoxicated, vulnerable men into a bloody civil war.
Right.
But then that same man draws a strict, unyielding moral line at stealing a wet hat from a drowning victim. I mean, how does the human brain construct that kind of moral maze?
Yeah, it's fascinating.
How does someone rationalize extortion and human exploitation on a Tuesday, but then act as this self-sacrificing savior during a shipwreck on a Wednesday? Today, we are stepping into the filth, the violence, and the profound psychological contradictions of 1870s New York to dissect the anatomy of an absolute rogue.
It really is a study in the absolute extremes of human behavior because, when we talk about neurodevelopment or trauma and societal conditioning, we usually look for clean data points.
Right. We want the narrative to make sense.
Exactly. We want the trajectory of a human life to make logical sense. But when you're dealing with the human soul and the psyche, especially in the brutal environment of the 19th century waterfront, there are just no straight lines. We are navigating the darkest depths of cognitive dissonance and addiction here.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. So our primary source today is this remarkable, really raw text. It's called Transformed, or The History of a River Thief, briefly told.
It's quite a title.
It is. Mm-hmm. And it was published by the subject himself, Jeremiah McAuley, back in 1876. Plus, it features this really fascinating preface written by Mrs. Helen E. Brown. We are going to explore the mechanics of how a man goes from being a ruthless, prize-fighting river thief and a convict and a bounty scammer to founding one of the most effective and famous rescue missions in New York history.
To set our thematic foundation, we really have to examine the tension that's laid out right at the beginning in Mrs. Brown's preface. She establishes this stark, deeply uncomfortable contrast between what she calls respectable sinners and the outcast and fallen.
Oh, that phrase, respectable sinners, it's so sharp.
It really is. And the central argument of this text, like the Crawdell thesis will be unraveling, is that no one is past the human hope of resurrection. The book basically throws down a sociological gauntlet.
How so?
Well, it argues that the exact same grace required to save a polished, polite, philanthropic member of high society is the exact same grace required to save a violent criminal. There is this democratization of human brokenness here that completely defied the rigid class structures of the 1870s.
Yeah, and she actually quotes a radical idea from her time. She notes that the publicans and the harlots go into the kingdom of God before you, meaning the outwardly polished, respectable folks who hide their moral failings behind wealth and status.
Exactly. It's a direct challenge to the establishment.
She writes that her goal is twofold. First, to encourage those who have absolutely no hope for themselves, and second, to challenge those whose faith is too weak or, too sanitized to believe that someone utterly cast down into the gutter can actually be pulled back up.
Right. And to understand the magnitude of the radical transformation we're going to see at the end of this deep dive, we can't just jump straight to the redemption. We first have to clinically examine the specific environment that built Jerry McAuley.
Right, the origin story.
We have to look at the making of a rogue. And that starts from the very first foundational cracks in his worldview.
So let's start in Ireland. Jerry's entry into the world is, in his own words, a dark beginning, broken up by sin.
Yeah.
His father is actually a counterfeiter who flints the law, basically abandoning the family before Jerry even really knows him.
Which is a massive trauma right from the start.
Yeah. So right out of the gate, you have the total absence of a stabilizing paternal figure, replaced by this ghost of a wanted criminal. And he's placed in the care of his grandmother, who the text describes as a devout Romanist.
And we need to contextualize what that meant in the mid-19th century. For an impoverished Irish family, religion wasn't just, a spiritual practice. It was the sole structural anchor in an otherwise totally destitute existence.
Right.
His first recollections of his grandmother are heavily sensory. He remembers watching her count her beads and literally prostrating herself to kiss the floor as an act of physical penance.
But I'm looking at this dynamic, and I'm thinking about how children process authority and authenticity.
Yeah.
Because Jory, being this mischievous, likely very neglected kid, would take the opportunity while she was face down on the floor to throw things at her head.
Which is such a striking image.
It is. And when she rose from her knees, breaking from this deep physical posture of sacred devotion, she would immediately pivot to cursing and swearing at him.
The whiplash there is intense.
Exactly. If I'm a child and I see an adult perform a sacred, supposedly transformative ritual and then immediately hurl abuse at me, I'm not just going to reject the ritual. I'm going to categorize all morality as a theatrical performance designed to manipulate people.
That is precisely the psychological mechanism at work here. You've hit on the exact root of his later cynicism.
Yeah.
Because children are incredibly astute behavioral economists, right?
Oh, totally. They see right through the facade.
They don't listen to the words adults say. They track the physical outcomes of adult behavior. For young Jerry, he is witnessing a profound, basically irreconcilable disconnect between faith and action.
Right.
If religion is merely a physical ritual, like counting beads or kissing a floor that doesn't actually alter human behavior or offer any emotional regulation, then it holds absolutely no moral authority to him.
It just teaches him that rules are a costume. I mean, morality is just a coat you put on when society is watching, and you take it off when you're angry.
Precisely. It entirely inoculates him against taking any institutional authority seriously later on. I mean, why should he respect laws or police officers or religious codes when his foundational baseline is that the people practicing these codes are fundamentally unchanged by them?
Right, it's all fake to him.
Yeah, this hypocrisy paves the way for a deep-seated, intensely protective cynicism.
So, armed with that cynicism, he is sent to New York City at age 13 to live with his married sister. And we have to picture New York in the late 1850s and early 1860s. This isn't a city with a robust social safety net.
Not at all. It was ruthless.
It's a hyper-capitalist, brutal environment for an immigrant kid. He starts running errands, assisting in business, and he notes that he quickly learns little tricks. Dishonesty basically becomes a survival tool for him.
It was adapt or perish.
Exactly. It doesn't take long for him to realize that the legitimate path is slow and unrewarding. So he decides he can live by his own wits. He leaves his sister's home and heads straight for Water Street.
Water Street. It is honestly impossible to overstate the socioeconomic vacuum of the Fourth Ward and Water Street during this era. It was the absolute epicenter of the maritime vice economy.
It's just totally lawless.
Completely. You had boarding houses that were essentially fronts for extortion, illegal bare-knuckle boxing rings, rampant prostitution, and an entire localized economy built entirely around separating sailors from their wages by any means necessary.
And Jerry moves right into the heart of it. He takes board with a family there, starts associating with two young men, and they begin a highly specific trade. They become river thieves. Now, the term sounds almost romantic, like a swashbuckling pirate. But the mechanics of this trade were dark, gritty, and physically exhausting.
Oh, absolutely grueling work.
Yeah, they had a small rowboat. They would row out into the treacherous currents of the East River or the harbor at night, completely blacked out. They would board commercial vessels in the darkness, steal whatever cargo they could lay their hands on, and row back.
And the cycle of this lifestyle is incredibly telling. Because they weren't stealing to build wealth or, invest in a future.
No 401ks for river thieves.
Exactly. They would take the stolen goods to fences in the city during the daytime, sell them for cash, dress up in flashy clothes, and blow every single cent in the vile dens and saloons of Water Street within hours. And alongside this, Jerry becomes a bare-knuckle prize fighter.
Looking at this ecosystem, I mean, it is identical to the sociology we see in modern cartel foot soldiers or street-level gang networks.
That's a really sharp parallel.
It's this closed, violently policed ecosystem where your status isn't built on education, intelligence, or societal contribution. Your status is built entirely on your capacity for physical dominance.
Your willingness to commit violence?
Yeah, and your ability to flaunt ill-gotten wealth. You steal. You flex the cash by dressing up to prove your dominance. You spend it all on vices to anesthetize the stress of the lifestyle, and then you wake up broke and start the hamster wheel of adrenaline all over again.
The comparison to organized crime is spot on because both environments demand a highly specific evolutionary adaptation. You basically have to turn off your long-term risk assessment.
Because if you think about tomorrow, you panic today.
Right. If you are constantly thinking about the future, you will freeze. You have to live entirely in a hyper-vigilant present. And just like modern criminal syndicates, there is a fatal flaw in this ecosystem.
Which is?
There is zero actual loyalty among the participants.
Oh, man. Which brings us to the great irony of his criminal career. Jerry becomes too good at being bad.
He overplayed his hand.
He really did. His violent nature, his prize fighting, his dominance, it actually makes him a liability to his own criminal associates. The ecosystem turns on him. They decide he's too dangerous or maybe just taking too much of the cuts, so they conspire against him.
And they frame him.
They do. They frame Jerry for a robbery he actually did not commit.
This is such a critical inflection point. The text specifically notes a legal reality of the time. It says he had no friends, no advocate at court.
Meaning he was on his own.
Entirely. As an impoverished Irish immigrant with a known criminal reputation and no financial backing, the legal system was never going to presume his innocence.
He reflects on this later, saying, "It is a bad thing, sinners, not to have an advocate at court." Because of this total lack of representation, he's convicted and sentenced to 15 years in Sing Sing State Prison.
15 years. It's a massive sentence.
It's basically a life sentence in that era. But here is where the narrative takes a bizarre psychological turn. I'm struggling with the math here. He is completely innocent of the specific crime that sends him away. Yet later in life, he credits this blatant failure of the justice system as God's ultimate mercy.
It sounds paradoxical.
It sounds like a form of retrospective Stockholm syndrome with a corrupt system.
Yeah.
I mean, how does he cognitively justify a rigged conviction as divine intervention?
It's a brilliant question, and it requires us to step outside the concept of legal fairness and look at the sheer physics of his trajectory. If Jerry had remained on Water Street, what was the statistical probability of his survival?
Pretty close to zero.
Exactly. He was a heavy-drinking, violent, prize-fighting thief operating in the dark on open water. He was going to catch a bullet from a ship's captain, get a knife in the ribs from a rival thief, or die of disease or alcohol poisoning within 24 months.
So the injustice was basically an emergency extraction.
That's exactly what it was. He couldn't see it then, of course. He was handcuffed and put on the train cars to Sing Sing, burning with a deeply justified vengeance. But the unjust prison sentence physically, forcibly removed him from a lethal ecosystem.
Wow.
The system's failure to give him a fair trial was the very mechanism that shielded him from his own inevitable murder.
That reframing is just staggering. But let's look at the reality of what he was extracted into, because we're moving from the chaotic violence of the river into the organized brutality of the state.
Yeah, it was brutal.
Jerry describes that train ride to the prison as the saddest hour of his life. He's looking back at his miseries, his sins, and he is just seething with this impotent rage. And when he arrives at Sing Sing, he hits a wall. For the first 2 years, he's completely emotionally calcified.
We have to understand the mechanics of the 19th century penal system to grasp what those 2 years were actually like. Sing Sing operated on the Auburn system.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. This wasn't just incarceration. It was designed as psychological demolition. It involved the strict silence system. Prisoners were forbidden from speaking to one another ever.
That sounds like torture.
It was. They moved in lockstep. They worked grueling, hard labor during the day and sat in tiny, damp, isolated cells at night. The goal was to completely break the prisoner's will. For a highly social, aggressive, kinetic prizefighter like Jerry, enforced silence and submission is a form of profound sensory and psychological torture.
Which explains why he ignored the prison chapel services for the first 2 years. He's in survival mode, just keeping his armor on. But the armor eventually cracks. The text refers to his discovery of the treasures hid in that precious book, the Bible.
Right.
He starts reading it. And knowing his personality, he probably didn't start reading it out of a sudden burst of piety. It was likely out of the sheer mind-numbing boredom and the desperate search for any mental stimulation in that solitary cell.
Oh, yeah. When your external stimuli are reduced to stone walls and silence, anything that provides a narrative becomes a lifeline. He begins to read, and the text begins to work on him.
But Jerry doesn't do anything quietly. He doesn't just read the Bible and sit in his cell contemplating. He immediately turns it into action. He starts an early underground ministry right there in the prison yard.
He couldn't help himself.
No. He starts praying for his fellow convicts. And I want to highlight the specific target he chooses. The very first convict he starts praying for is a man named Jack Dare.
Now, Jack Dare is not a random selection.
Not at all.
Dare was one of the most popular, notorious convicts in the prison and was actually known as one of the leaders of a previous prison revolt.
This detail is everything. It shows Jerry's underlying psychological framework hasn't changed. It's just been redirected. He's a prize fighter. He understands the hierarchy of the yard. If you want to make an impact, you don't go to the weakest guy. You go after the alpha.
You challenge the strongest guy in the room.
Exactly. He picks the hardest target to test the validity of this new faith.
It's a highly pragmatic, stress-testing approach to religion. If this faith is real, it has to work on a guy like Jack Dare. and Jerry's faith grows. He eventually starts praying for his own liberty. He asks the Lord for his freedom, and he notes that he received a clear, divine assurance that his desire would be granted.
And amazingly, it is.
Against all odds, after serving exactly 7 years and 6 months, which is precisely half of his 15-year sentence, he receives an official pardon from the governor of New York.
So he steps out of those stone walls back into the free world. And this is where the narrative takes a turn that is incredibly realistic and just devastating. Because rehabilitation is not a clean upward graph.
It never is.
He experiences a catastrophic fall from grace. Jerry writes, "The dear Savior who had been so gracious and so precious to me in the prison I let go, how I wonder now that he did not let me go." But he did not.
The whiplash of freedom is a really well-documented psychological phenomenon for the institutionalized. Think about it. For 7.5 years, his every hour was dictated by guards.
He had zero autonomy.
Right. The external structure was incredibly rigid. Suddenly, he's back in New York City, the structure evaporates, the immediate threat of the lash is gone, and the ambient noise of his old life comes rushing back in.
He initially tries the legitimate route, though. He gets a job in a large hat shop. But Jerry is still Jerry. He has a dominant, highly disruptive, charismatic personality. The workmen at the shop decide to have a strike.
And Jerry jumps right in.
Instead of keeping his head down and protecting his hard-won freedom, Jerry becomes one of the primary ringleaders of the strike. He escalates the situation, gets everyone fired, including himself, and is suddenly thrown completely out of employment.
Which is the worst possible trigger.
Yeah, and this loss of income triggers a pivot into a business that is, quite frankly, atrocious.
We are talking about the bounty business during the American Civil War.
So let's break down the mechanics of this scheme. During the Civil War, specifically after the Conscription Act, the government and local municipalities were offering massive cash bounties. We're talking sometimes hundreds of dollars, which was a fortune back then.
A literal fortune.
Right. They did this to get men to enlist in the military or to act as paid substitutes for wealthy men who had been drafted. Jerry realizes there is a massive inefficiency in this market that he can exploit. He basically becomes a broker of human bodies.
It's chilling.
He writes that he would pick men up wherever he could find them, get them half drunk, and coax them to enlist. The men would sign the papers, receive the massive bounty payout, and Jerry would act as their agent and take a massive premium, sometimes stealing half the amount before the guy even sobered up.
I want to pause and dissect the psychology here, because on the river, Jerry was a thief. He stole inanimate cargo. It was violent, yes, but it was property crime. This bounty scheme is a profound psychological escalation.
Right. It feels fundamentally different. The level of sociopathy required to sit across from a vulnerable man, pour him drinks until his cognitive functions shut down, and then legally sign his life away to face a firing line. I mean, that's human trafficking masked by wartime bureaucracy.
It absolutely is.
Is this just opportunistic greed, or is there a deliberate psychological numbing happening?
It is absolute emotional anesthetization. To execute this kind of predatory exploitation, you have to systematically murder your own empathy. You have to view human beings not as souls, but as raw commodities to be liquidated.
Which means suppressing everything he learned in prison.
Exactly. Jerry had found his conscience in prison. To survive the guilt of what he's doing now, he has to smother that newly awakened conscience under a mountain of rationalization and alcohol.
And the money flows in.
Yeah.
He uses this massive influx of cash to become a sportsman. He buys fancy clothes, goes to the horse races, spends freely, and tries to construct an identity of success. But the downward trajectory is accelerating.
It's a spiral.
He partners up with a man, and they go back to the river. But they aren't just stealing cargo anymore. The crimes mutate. They buy stolen goods from sailors. Then, knowing the sailors are compromised, Jerry and his partner blackmail them.
Extort.
Yeah. They extort the sailors, threatening to have them arrested by the police for the stolen goods unless the sailors enlist in the military. When the terrified sailors enlist, Jerry takes their bounty money.
It is extortion, kidnapping, and fraud operating in a single terrifying loop. And we get a glimpse into the physical toll of this lifestyle through a grim detail in the text. His partner in this operation eventually dies of delirium tremens.
We hear that term thrown around in historical texts, but let's explain what that actually means. What is happening in the body to cause death by delirium tremens? Because it really highlights the severity of the environment Jerry's surviving in.
Right, so delirium tremens, or DTs, is the most severe form of alcohol withdrawal. When you consume massive amounts of alcohol over a long period, your brain's chemistry fundamentally alters. Alcohol is a depressant. It enhances GABA, which calms the brain, and suppresses glutamate, which excites it.
So the brain gets used to being artificially calmed.
Exactly. And to keep you awake, your brain eventually compensates by producing massive, unnatural amounts of excitatory neurotransmitters. If you suddenly stop drinking, or if you simply can't drink enough to meet the new threshold, the alcohol suppression lifts, but the brain is still flooding itself with excitatory chemicals.
Oh, wow. So just overloads.
The nervous system effectively short-circuits. It causes profound confusion, terrifying hallucinations, uncontrollable tremors, dangerous spikes in blood pressure, and lethal seizures. Dying of DTs means dying in a state of absolute physiological terror and cardiovascular collapse. That is the baseline reality of Jerry's daily life.
And to fuel this addiction, Jerry opens a drinking house, a den of infamy on the waterfront. He is actively, aggressively trying to drown his own internal moral compass in whiskey. He knows what the right thing is. He experienced it in Sing Sing, but he's pushing it down.
He's fighting it every step of the way.
However, the universe, or God as the text frames it, is not going to let him go quietly. The narrative now shifts from his descent into a series of terrifying interventions. We see the Hound of Heaven entering the picture. Jerry faces close calls and the relentless pursuit of his own suppressed conscience.
The Hound of Heaven is the perfect theological and psychological framework for this sequence. It represents this relentless, almost aggressive pursuit by grace. Jerry is sprinting in the opposite direction, but reality begins to intervene in increasingly chaotic, near-fatal ways.
Let's examine the first major intervention, the Steamboat Idaho fire. I want to paint this scene clearly. Jerry and his partner are out on the river in Brooklyn in their small rowboat. They've stealthily tied their little craft to a massive regular commuter ferry boat called the Idaho to get a free tow across the dark water to the New York side.
Which was a common, if dangerous, practice.
Suddenly, out of nowhere, they discover the Idaho is on fire.
And 19th century wooden steamboats did not burn slowly. The text notes that it seemed like the work of a single moment from the first alarm until the entire superstructure of the boat was engulfed in flames.
It is absolute apocalyptic chaos. The fire is roaring, passengers are screaming in terror, people are throwing themselves over the railings into the freezing, treacherous currents of the river to escape burning to death. Jerry writes that the screams of the perishing and the desperate struggles of the creatures in the water deeply impressed his mind.
It triggered him.
It immediately evoked the terrifying imagery of the biblical last day and the fiery hell he was utterly convinced he was heading toward.
He is literally witnessing his own internal spiritual terror manifested in physical reality right in front of him.
And in the middle of this horrific scene, his partner exhibits pure sociopathy. His partner looks at the people drowning, screaming for help, and then he looks at the expensive cloaks, hats, and belongings floating in the water around them.
Oh, this part is so dark.
His partner says, "Let the people go. Let's pick up the stuff." He wants to ignore the drowning human beings to harvest wet hats.
But Jerry refuses.
Jerry says, "No, I haven't got so low as that yet." And instead of plundering, Jerry actually helps pull the drowning people out of the freezing water to safety on the land.
This is a massive psychological tell.
This is the paradox I mentioned at the start. I am trying to reconcile this. How does a man who operates a human trafficking ring, masked by the military draft, a man who extorts terrified sailors, suddenly draw an unyielding moral line at stealing wet hats from drowning victims? What does this reveal about how criminals construct their moral codes?
It reveals the absolute necessity of a moral baseline, a psychological floor, so to speak, to prevent total ego collapse. When an individual is engaging in abhorrent behavior, cognitive dissonance sets in.
Right.
To survive that dissonance without going mad, the criminal mind creates a highly specific, often totally arbitrary moral hierarchy. They have to define someone else's actions as monstrous so they can define themselves as merely flawed.
Like saying, I may be an extortionist and a thief, but I am not a ghoul. I'm a professional, not a scavenger.
Exactly. It is a vital defense mechanism. If Jerry admits he has no lines at all that he would let a person drown for a $2 hat, he has to face the total unbearable horror of his own soul.
He can't handle that.
By drawing this specific line in the water, he is preserving a tiny, microscopic sliver of his humanity. He is proving to himself that he's still capable of virtue. And that tiny preserved sliver of conscience is exactly what will eventually be used to break his defenses completely open.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
He needs to believe he's still a man, not a monster.
Yeah.
But this intervention doesn't stop him. He goes right back to the crime. The next incident highlights the sheer absurdity of his risk assessment. The incident of the $1.50 rope fender.
This one is just baffling.
They are sneaking up on a ship docked in Brooklyn. Jerry is trying to steal a rope fender, which is just a woven bumper hung over the side to keep the ship's hull from rubbing against the wooden dock. The entire item is worth maybe $1.50.
The economics of this crime are baffling.
The ship's captain spots them in the dark. He doesn't yell. He just pulls out a revolver and opens fire on Jerry. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Jerry says the bullets came so incredibly close he could literally feel the air displacement as they whizzed past his head. But none of them strike him.
He is risking taking a fatal bullet to the brain for pocket change. This illustrates how entirely degraded his sense of self-worth has become. He places absolutely zero value on his own existence.
And then comes the near drowning, which serves as the final, profound external shock to his system. Jerry and his partner are out on another plundering expedition. Jerry is incredibly intoxicated. He is so impaired that he can't even safely participate in boarding the target ship.
He's a liability at this point.
He has to stay behind in their small rowboat while his partner does the actual robbery.
And while waiting, in his impaired state, he slips. Jerry falls out of the boat into the dark, freezing currents of the river.
The physics of the river take over. The boat drifts in one direction, and the powerful underwater eddy catches Jerry and pulls him down. He's sinking into the blackness. He touches the muddy bottom. He struggles and rises to the surface, gasping, only to sink again.
It's terrifying.
He rises again, his lungs burning. Finally, miraculously, the shifting tide brings the drifting rowboat back toward him. The shock of the freezing water has sobered him up just enough to allow him to grab the gunwale and drag his heavy, soaked body over the side.
He is lying in the bottom of the boat, freezing, having just narrowly escaped asphyxiation. And in that immediate aftermath, he experiences a cognitive event.
Yes. He hears a voice. A clear, incredibly distinct impression hits his mind like a physical blow. The voice says, "God has saved you for the last time. If you ever go out on the river again, God will let you drop into hell and be lost."
Now, consider the standard narrative of a near-death experience. How does Jerry react to this profound survival and this apparent divine ultimatum?
Well, you would naturally assume he falls to his knees, weeping with gratitude, promising to change his ways. But he doesn't. He's absolutely furious. He is enraged.
He's angry he survived.
He pulls his partner into the boat without speaking a single word, rows violently back to shore, goes home, dries his clothes, and he is just vibrating with this massive, crushing load of guilt and anger. He immediately tries to drink it away. He pours liquor down his throat, drink after drink, but he notes that no amount of alcohol could drown that inward voice.
Let's unpack the psychology of that anger. Why is he furious instead of grateful? I mean, why does surviving make him so angry?
I imagine it's because his illusion is shattered.
Precisely. Surviving a near-death experience in that specific manner, being talked around by an eddy, completely annihilates the illusion of control. When you are an addict or living a high-stakes, violent lifestyle, the only way you endure it is by telling yourself you are managing the risk.
You convince yourself you're the master of your own fate.
You tell yourself you are at the wheel, you are the apex predator on the river. But sinking helplessly to the bottom of the freezing water proves you are entirely powerless. The voice in his head forces him to confront his absolute mortality and the staggering weight of his guilt.
The anger is just a mask.
Exactly. The anger is a secondary protective emotion. It is masking sheer, unadulterated terror. He is raging against the reality that he's fundamentally out of control, and worse, that he's being held accountable by a higher power, or even just by the inescapable logic of his own suppressed conscience.
And the alcohol stops working.
He tries to anesthetize that terror with his usual medicine, whiskey, but his physiological and psychological tolerance for the anesthesia has broken down. The horrifying reality is bleeding through the alcohol.
Which brings us to the ultimate turning point. He survived the apocalyptic fire. He survived the point-blank bullets. He survived the freezing water. External threats could not penetrate his armor. But now Jerry is cornered by something much more mundane and therefore much more dangerous.
His own poverty and exhaustion.
The narrative shifts here from dramatic, cinematic action on the river to a very quiet, incredibly radical act of grace.
This is the moment where the entire trajectory of his life pivots. We've seen that external threats of death or hell don't work. It requires an internal collapse driven by sheer desperation.
Here's the setup for that collapse. Jerry's partner suffers an accident, which physically prevents them from rowing out on the river to steal. Because they blow all their money on liquor instantly, they have no savings. They are, in Jerry's words, dead broke and literally starving.
The physical toll is breaking him.
Jerry is desperate enough that he decides to take the pledge, the formal temperance pledge, to stop drinking.
But look at the immediate, almost farcical context of that pledge. It perfectly encapsulates the neurobiology of addiction.
It is a dark, tragic comedy. Jerry looks at his partner, Tom, and announces, "I have just taken the pledge." And Tom, who happens to be holding a bottle of gin at that exact moment, just pours a full glass and hands it to Jerry.
Unbelievable.
And Jerry takes it. He takes the glass of gin, drinks it completely down, and as he puts the empty glass on the table, he says, "Now this is the last drink I shall ever take." And Tom just laughs in his face and says, "Yes, till you get the next."
It is the ultimate lie of the addict's brain, making a solemn, sincere vow of sobriety while the substance that is destroying you is literally traveling down your throat. It highlights the total collapse of his executive function.
He has nothing left.
He has zero willpower left. He cannot architect his own salvation.
And precisely at that moment of total, humiliating failure, a city missionary walks into their room. Jerry's immediate reaction is shame. He turns away, trying to hide his gin-soaked breath, terrified of being judged or found out. But the missionary doesn't yell. He just calmly invites Jerry out for a walk.
And during this walk, the pressure finally cracks the facade.
Jerry confesses. He completely breaks down and tells the missionary the ugly, unvarnished truth. He and Tom are completely broke, they're starving, and they are planning to go out on the river that very night to steal, because they must have money to survive.
Now, put yourself in the shoes of a religious figure in the 1870s, hearing a confession of premeditated violent theft. What is the expected institutional response?
A stern lecture, a recitation of the Ten Commandments, a threat to call the police, or at least a threat of eternal damnation.
Moral condemnation. That was the standard operating procedure. But that is not what this missionary does.
The missionary looks sad, not angry. He looks Jerry in the eyes and says, "Jerry, before you shall do that, I'll take this coat off my back and pawn it and give you the money."
I want us to linger here because this is the crux of the entire narrative. Why did this specific quiet intervention work when years in a brutal prison, near drownings, and bullets whizzing past his head completely failed?
It's like a martial artist using his opponent's momentum against him. Jerry has spent his entire life bracing for physical and legal impact. He expects a punch, a bullet, or a judge's gavel. He has a wall of psychological calluses.
That's a great way to put it.
The missionary doesn't strike the calluses. He slips completely past Jerry's defenses by offering a vulnerable, profound sacrifice. Jerry literally has no neural pathways built to deflect unconditional physical generosity.
That is an exquisite analogy. The missionary didn't offer a theoretical sermon on the abstract evils of stealing. He offered a visceral, deeply inconvenient physical sacrifice. His own winter coat.
Yeah, shorts him out.
Exactly. Jerry knew how to survive a physical brawl, but he was utterly disarmed by radical grace. The generosity acted as a circuit breaker for his destructive loop.
The missionary then quotes a scripture to him, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." And Jerry, completely shattered by the offer of the coat, replies, "I'll take that text and trust God."
The missionary leaves and actually comes back with 50 cents, likely from his own meager pockets or from pawning an item so Jerry and his partner can buy food. The theft is prevented. But more importantly, Jerry's entire cynical worldview is dismantled in an instant.
The worldview forged by his grandmother's hypocrisy and the brutality of the river.
Right. It's gone.
The cycle is broken. He experiences what he calls salvation. But the text is wonderfully honest here. The struggle isn't magically over. The angels don't sing and make his life easy. The cost of righteousness in a capitalist survival setting is incredibly steep.
It always is.
Jerry gets a legitimate job working as a day laborer at the ferry company. As his faith grows, he feels a deep conviction to keep the Sabbath holy, to not work on Sunday so he can honor his new life.
Which is a massive, incredibly dangerous economic risk for an ex-convict with zero safety net.
Huge. And the friction of morality hits him immediately. He tells his boss he can't work Sundays. He is promptly fired by his boss, a man referred to as Captain C. Jerry taps the captain on the shoulder and asks, "Captain C, have you discharged me for trying to do right?"
And the response is chilling.
The captain replies with the brutal, cold indifference of the 19th century economy. He says, "You haven't accommodated me, and I can't accommodate you."
If we connect this back to anyone trying to change their life today, it is such a profound truth. Doing the right thing, breaking a cycle of addiction or crime, does not magically pave your road with gold.
Often it makes things harder.
Very often, the immediate result of newly found integrity is the loss of your livelihood, your comfort, and your social circle. The system pushes back hard when you change your trajectory.
But the miracle here is that Jerry doesn't go back to the river. He accepts the cost. He endures the friction. Which leads us to the culmination of his journey. Having finally secured his own internal transformation, Jerry must figure out what to do with his life. And where does he go?
He turns back around.
He turns right back around and heads straight for the exact streets that nearly killed him.
It is the classic archetype of the hero's journey. The initiate survives the descent into the underworld, finds the elixir, and must return to the village to share it. He turns his focus back to Water Street.
But it's a slow build. It doesn't happen overnight. He starts with early, small testimonies. He starts speaking out at his new day jobs. He reproves a fellow workman for swearing, and the response is immediate mockery.
Naturally.
The guys call him a churchman and a hypocrite, knowing his violent past. But he absorbs the mockery and keeps at it, and he successfully leads a German co-worker to experience the same conversion he did. Once he sees that he can replicate the transformation in others, he scales up. He starts fundraising.
He takes his story to the religious camp meetings that were popular at the time.
Right. He goes to the Sing Sing campground into Ocean Grove. He stands up and tells his raw story, and he raises $450.
Yeah.
Which in 1872 is a very substantial amount of capital.
It was enough to start a movement.
In October of 1872, he secures a physical property, 316 Water Street. It is located right next door to where another famous mission, the John Allen meetings, used to be. They clean out this space, and they put out a simple, profound sign over the door, Helping Hand for Men.
The location of that building is highly symbolic. He isn't opening a pristine chapel in an upscale neighborhood. He is planting a flag of hope in the very soil where he used to sow violence and destruction. He is reclaiming the territory.
And running a mission in the epicenter of the Fourth Ward's criminal ecosystem means he isn't dealing with polite theological disagreements. He is dealing with the hardest people in the city.
There is this one incredible scene in the book where he gets into a theological showdown with a Catholic man who wanders in.
Oh, this is a great moment.
The man looks at Jerry and claims that while Protestants might go to heaven, turncoats, meaning former Catholics who convert to Protestantism, like Jerry, will absolutely be damned to hell.
And Jerry's response to this dogmatic attack is a masterclass in what we would later call William James-style pragmatism.
It really is. Jerry doesn't argue ancient church history. He points to his own physical reality. Jerry argues that his new faith reached down and picked him out of the literal gutter. It cured his vicious, lethal drunkenness. It stopped his violent thieving.
It gave him his life back. It made him a productive, loving, sober human being. He tells the man, according to your rigid theory, this transformation is just fitting me for hell, so it must be the work of Satan. But if Satan is the one who cleaned me up, stopped me from stealing, and gave me a desire to help others, then Satan has become a very, very good friend to me.
It's brilliant logic. Jerry measures truth not by blind adherence to ancestral tradition or complex theological dogma, but by its verifiable, transformative power on human behavior.
The proof is in the pudding.
Exactly. He rejects what he calls the traditions of the church in favor of a lived present salvation. If a belief system cures a violent river thief of his addiction and his cruelty, that belief system validates itself entirely through its physical results.
It's undeniable evidence. You can argue with a theology textbook, but you cannot argue with a radically changed life standing right in front of you. Now, Jerry has this raw, pragmatic theology, and he's planted his flag on Water Street. But running a mission in this environment, dealing daily with hardened criminals, destitute sailors, and individuals trapped in the vice trade, that is not a one-man job.
It takes a team.
How does he actually penetrate those specific, highly defensive demographics?
He absolutely does not do it alone, and this is where we see the operational brilliance of his partnership with his wife, Maria. Maria's trajectory is not the side note. It is the crucial parallel arc of redemption that makes the Water Street mission function.
Maria's story is incredible. She was also raised a Romanist, brought up in similar environments of superstition and poverty. She came to the city to earn a living, was exposed to the brutal temptations of New York, and acquired a deep, destructive love for the intoxicating cup.
She was right there in the trenches with him, in a way.
She was a heavy drinker, caught in the exact same undertow of the city's vice economy, but she was converted at the John Allen mission.
She was freed from the physiological and psychological bondage of her appetite, and once she was free, she became a Bible reader. acting as an outreach worker in the infamous Fourth Ward.
She possessed an astonishing bravery. The text details how she would physically enter the dens of infamy, the dark tenement houses, and the violent liquor saloons, taking her message into the darkest corners where a man might be immediately attacked. It's a true partnership.
It really is.
Two people who survived the exact same underworld, finding each other and returning to the fire to pull others out.
They possess the ultimate credential for the work: shared trauma. A respectable, polished clergyman from an uptown seminary would have absolutely zero credibility walking into a Water Street saloon.
They'd eat him alive.
They would laugh him out or rob him. But Jerry and Maria have the physical and emotional scars to prove they intimately understand the pain, the addiction, and the desperation of the people they are trying to reach. Their past sins became their professional qualifications.
And the book culminates in chapter 17 with this beautiful, profoundly grounding scene. A Thanksgiving dinner hosted at the Mission House. It is a bountiful, massive feast provided by Christian friends, specifically reserved for the needy, the hungry, and the outcast of the neighborhood.
It's the perfect ending.
It is the ultimate, tangible culmination of that present salvation Jerry argued for. It isn't just about saving ethereal souls for some distant afterlife. It is about feeding starving bodies, breaking the cycle of poverty, and restoring human dignity right now, on Thanksgiving Day, with a hot plate of food.
If we synthesize this entire journey and bring it all the way back to the preface by Mrs. Helen E. Brown, the chaotic, violent, ultimately beautiful life of Jerry McAuley proves her thesis flawlessly. The respectable sinners of the world, those who hide their flaws behind wealth, have absolutely no moral high ground.
We're all on the same playing field.
The polished person who looks down their nose at the addict requires the exact same mechanism of grace as the river thief.
It is the ultimate equalizer. And it reminds us of the sheer, staggering resilience of the human brain and the human spirit. No matter how deep the rut is, even if you're running a predatory Civil War bounty scam, or risking your life stealing rope fenders while dodging bullets, or drinking yourself into lethal seizures in an 1870s dive bar, the narrative can be rewritten.
It's never too late.
The diagnostic x-ray might look like a shattered, unsalvageable mess, but with the right intervention, the bone can heal stronger than it was before.
The murky, violent waters can eventually clear.
Yes. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. Think about that unnamed city missionary, the man who looked at a starving, threatening, desperate thief and offered to take the winter coat off his own back and pawn it to stop the man from destroying himself.
Such a powerful moment.
In our modern world, we have highly organized bureaucratic charities, we have seamless apps for giving, we have automated monthly donations that trigger without us even thinking about it, all of which are wonderful and necessary.
Absolutely.
But in outsourcing our charity to algorithms, have we lost the world-changing power of the deeply personal, profoundly inconvenient, face-to-face sacrifice? What is the coat you could take off your back to offer someone who is at the absolute end of their rope today? Think about that. Until next time, keep diving deep.